Holy Writ, written by H.L. Mencken, published in the Smart Set magazine, October 1923. Almost 100 years old. Holy Writ, Section 1. Enough good intentions are concealed in the Riverside New Testament, a translation from the original Greek into the English of today, by the Reverend William G. Ballantyne, D.D., LL.D., to pave all the avenues and side streets of hell from the Jonathan Edwards Monument to the Boulevard of the Popes. It is the pious and laborious work of a divine now in his 75th year, and its laudable purpose is to clear Holy Writ of its howlers and archaisms, and so bring it within the understanding of the average American reader of today. What Dr. Ballantyne hopes to accomplish by it, as he says, is to bring what he calls divine truth down to the grasp of persons who get no meaning at all, or a meaning that is mistaken, out of the authorized version. That is, down to the generality of Americans, lay and clerical. But I greatly fear that what he will achieve, if this translation is widely circulated, is rather the propagation of agnosticism. For, when they are put into plain English, some of the most venerated passages in the New Testament begin to seem banal and dubious, and others begin to seem silly, and yet others begin to seem downright idiotic. In the authorized version, their imbecility is concealed by the extremely elevated and beautiful dialect in which they are set forth. But in the speech of every day, it is only too plain. Worse, it appears to me that Dr. Ballantyne often makes a mess of his work, even when he is most faithful to his purpose, that he often fails at his primary business of converting the archaisms of the authorized version into phrases that even a Methodist clergyman should understand. I turn at random, for example, to Matthew 8, and encounter one of the most familiar and moving speeches of Jesus. The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. Dr. Ballantyne seeks to improve this by changing nests to coverts and hath into has. What a botch indeed! Nests is the natural, the inevitable word. It instantly conjures up a living image. It is absolutely simple and clear. But how many Christians in America, without resort to the dictionary, should give a sound definition of coverts? Certainly not 5%. I doubt, in fact, that Dr. Ballantyne himself could do it, for he uses the word in a very far-fetched sense. Covert means, primarily, cover for ground game, a shelter in a thicket or copse. The birds of the air do not resort to coverts, they resort to nests, as the inestimable Matthew plainly says. I find many other such inept renderings without leaving the first gospel. Matthew 5:17, for example, there is the historic pronouncement, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Dr. Ballantyne converts the last clause into the incredibly clumsy and confusing, "I have not come to do away with them, but to fill them full." To fill them full? What on earth does that mean? With what is he going to fill them? It would be hard to imagine any worse nonsense than that, but there is actually worse. In the 40th verse of the same chapter, "And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat," the venerable translator changes coat into tunic. Will this help the morons, or simply stump them? In the next verse, And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, shall compel is changed to commandeer, which has been current English only since the Boer War and is still quite incomprehensible to millions. Finally, still remaining in Matthew, I come to the Lord's Prayer in chapter 6, the version read daily in the public schools of all the American states that are Christian, and familiar even to congressmen, bishops, and the inmates of houses of correction. Here, if you don't know it, is the authorized version. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. And here, omitting the doxology, which is not found in the oldest Greek manuscripts, is Dr. Ballantyne's horror. Our Father in heaven, thy name be kept holy. Thy kingdom come, thy will prevail, as in heaven, so on earth. Our bread for the coming day give us today, and forgive us our failures, as we forgive those who fail toward us. And bring us not into trial, and save us from evil. Section 2. But this almost inconceivably fatuous effort to gild the lily is not the worst of Dr. Ballantyne's offendings. He is far more dangerous to the faith, I believe, when he achieves his avowed purpose, that is, when his version of the Greek original is actually clearer and better than the rendering of the King James Version. What misleads him here is a misapprehension of the nature of religious feeling. He seems to think that it is the product of an intellectual process, that it arises out of ideas. It really has its origin in a sense of mystery, a complete escape from ideas. It seizes upon the mind most powerfully, indeed, when the evidence of its objective truth are most vague and unconvincing. In brief, when it is apprehended not as fact, but as poetry, the negation, or at all events, the antithesis of fact. The success of Christianity in the world, as I have often argued, is due chiefly, if not wholly, to the incomparable beauty, as poetry, of its sacred books. It is hard to think of any other Oriental religion that is not logically more plausible and persuasive, but not one of them has a sacred literature that is even remotely to be compared, for sheer gaudy loveliness, to that of the decadent Judaism, which, alone among them, has enchanted the West. There are single psalms that have 10 times more beauty in them than the whole literature of Brahmanism, ancient and modern. In the story of the Christ child, there is greater poetry than ever was heard of in Greece or Rome. It is this profound and disarming poetry, this irresistible evocation of the unattainable and ever to be desired, that gives Christianity its undiminished strength, despite the gradual destruction of all its so-called evidences. Poetry, I repeat, does not fetch a sentient man by convincing him, it fetches him by robbing him of the wish to be convinced, by lulling his critical faculties, and setting him off upon an emotional debauch. Certainly there are few educated men left in the world who believe literally that Mary was got with child by God, or that the shepherds on the hills were guided to the manger by a dancing star, or that wise men came from the east to hail the newborn king in the manger at Bethlehem. Nevertheless, that man must be a dull clod indeed who is not moved by the simple and charming story, and made to wish, a bit wistfully, that such things could really be. It is, of all the stories ever devised by man, enormously the most beautiful. The Jews, when they invented it, conquered the whole Western world. Now, poetry, as everyone knows, is a fragile flower, and will not bear transplanting. Certainly not anatomizing. It cannot be reduced to plain propositions without losing everything that makes it what it is, without becoming, in fact, the very reverse of itself. Try the experiment with any poem that you admire, even with Mary Had a Little Lamb. In prose, all its bloom is gone. It becomes simply nonsense. This is true, of course, of great poetry, as well as of poetry that is not great, as every attempt at a prose translation of the Odyssey bears witness. It is preeminently true of the vast body of poetry which makes up the sacred books of Christianity. Try it with any of the Psalms, with the Sermon on the Mount, with the story of the Nativity, with the roaring strophes of Revelations. The thing becomes, in the speech of every day, a mere absurdity. It is not only not moving, it is somewhat even laughable. To get the savor of it, one must have the archaic language that it stands in, with its curiously inverted syntax, its strange and often barbaric phrases, its mysterious and scarcely comprehended terms. In other words, to get the savor, one must have the savor. Dr. Ballantyne, in his translation, has squeezed it all out. His New Testament, ceasing to be a great poem, becomes nothing more than a series of improbable anecdotes. I cannot imagine it making any new believers, save perhaps among idiots. On the contrary, it will very likely unmake not a few old believers. This is saying that it fails of its central aim, certainly and disastrously, that all the piety of the learned and reverend translator has gone into an enterprise that will delight and prosper the devil. Seeking to make customers for theology, he has only succeeded in scaring off customers for poetry. I am convinced, indeed, that even a congregation of Presbyterians, if his banal prose were read to them aloud, would begin to cough, shuffle their feet, and look at their watches. Well, let us not heap opprobrium upon him. When he stands up to answer for his crime on the judgment morn, he will at least be able to say that he followed lofty precedent and thought himself in good company. The dock indeed will be full of holy men who sought to promote the faith by bringing the Bible to the multitude. A great folly. Poetry is always better heard than read, and it is best heard where the lights are dim and a certain spookiness prevails. Let the priests read it, with vows to protect them, and then tell the simple folk what is suitable for simple folk to hear. Above all, what is within the limits of their imagination, their sense of beauty. Whoever it was that translated the Bible into excellent French prose is chiefly responsible for the collapse of Christianity in France. Contrariwise, the men who put the Bible into archaic, sonorous, and often unintelligible English gave Christianity a new lease of life wherever English is spoken. They did their work at a time of great theological blather and turmoil, when men of all sorts, even the least intelligent, were beginning to take a vast and unhealthy interest in exegetics and apologetics. They were far too shrewd to feed this disconcerting thirst for ideas with a Bible in plain English. It was deliberately artificial even when it was new. They thus dispersed the mob by appealing to its emotions, as a mother quiets a baby by crooning to it. The Bible that they produced was so unutterably beautiful that the great majority of men, in the face of it, could not fix their minds upon ideas. To this day It has enchanted the English-speaking peoples so effectively that, in the main, they remain Christians, at least sentimentally. Paine has assaulted them, Darwin and Huxley have assaulted them, and a multitude of other merchants of facts have assaulted them, but they still remember the 23rd Psalm when the doctor begins to shake his head, and they are still moved beyond compare, though not, alas, to acts, by the Sermon on the Mount, and they still turn once a year from their sordid and degrading labors to immerse themselves unashamed in the story of the manger. It is not much, but it is something. I do not admire the general run of American Christians, Methodists, United Brethren, Baptists, and such vermin. But try to imagine what the average low-browed Methodist would be if he were not a Methodist, but an atheist. The Latin Church, which I constantly find myself admiring, despite the occasional astounding imbecilities, has always kept clearly before it the fact that religion is not a syllogism but a poem. It is accused by Protestant dervishes of withholding the Bible from the people. To some extent this is true. To some extent the Church is wise. Again, to the same extent it is prosperous. Its toyings with ideas, in the main, have been confined to its clergy, and they have commonly reduced the business to a harmless play of technicalities, the awful concepts of heaven and hell brought down by the level of a dispute of doctors in long gowns, eager only to dazzle other doctors. Its great theologians remain unknown to 99% of its adherents. The great theologians of Protestantism, Wesley, Billy Sunday, and the like, are as vulgarly familiar as Babe Ruth. Rome, indeed, has not only preserved the original poetry in Christianity, it has also made capital additions to that poetry. For example, the poetry of the saints, of Mary, and of the liturgy itself. A solemn high mass is 1,000 times as impressive to a man with any genuine religious sense in him as the most powerful sermon ever roared under the big top by a Presbyterian auctioneer of God. In the face of such overwhelming beauty, it is not necessary to belabor the faithful with logic. They are better convinced by letting them alone. Preaching is not an essential part of the Latin ceremonial. It was very little employed in the early Church, and I am convinced that good effects would flow from abandoning it today, or at all events, reducing it to a few sentences, more or less formal. In the United States, the Latin brethren have been seduced by the example of the Protestants, who commonly transform an act of worship into a puerile intellectual exercise. Instead of approaching God in fear and wonder, these Protestants settle back on their pews, cross their legs, and listen to an ignoramus try to prove that he is a better theologian than the Pope. This folly the Romans now slide into. Their clergy begin to grow argumentative, doctrinaire, ridiculous. It is a pity. A bishop in his robes, playing his part in the solemn ceremonial of the Mass, is a dignified spectacle. The same bishop bawling against Darwin half an hour later is seen to be simply an elderly Irishman with a bald head, the son of a respectable police sergeant in South Bend, Indiana. Let the reverend fathers go back to Bach. If they keep on spoiling poetry and spouting ideas, the day will come when some extra bombastic deacon will astound humanity and insult God by proposing to translate the liturgy into American, that all the faithful may be convinced by it. And thank you for listening. H.L. Mencken was a notorious atheist. I think he's more notorious today for many things he said. But my mother, when I was a teenager, said you might enjoy H.L. Mencken because he is shouting against the stupidity of the world as it is, which is something one does as a teenager. Then you get older and you realize that shouting doesn't do much, it just makes you hoarse. And so I will finish this recording as I have gotten hoarse doing it.